Picture this. Gleaming skyscrapers pierce the sky in Dubai and Shanghai. Luxury, power, and possibility stretch as far as the eye can see. Now shift your gaze to Kinshasa or Lagos, cities sitting on some of the most valuable land on Earth, yet struggling with crumbling roads, blackouts, and broken water systems. How does that happen? How can a continent holding the world's greatest concentration of natural wealth still struggle to feed its people, power its cities, and govern itself effectively? That question sits at the heart of everything we are about to explore. And before we go any further, let us be absolutely clear about one thing. This is not a story about laziness. It is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about a trap, sophisticated, deliberate, and deeply rooted, that has kept one of humanity's richest homelands artificially poor for generations. Stay with us. Now, before we unpack how this trap works, we need to truly understand what we are talking about when we say Africa is rich. Not rich in a vague, poetic sense, rich in a way that should make every economist on Earth stand up and take notice. Africa holds over 30% of the entire world's mineral reserves. 30%. It sits on the largest known reserves of cobalt, platinum, manganese, and diamonds on the planet. 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land lies across this continent, enough to feed billions. And by 2050, Africa's youth will make up 40% of the entire global workforce. Let that sink in. Resources underground, resources above ground, and a human capital pipeline unlike anything the world has ever seen. By every logical measure, Africa should be an economic superpower, not a developing region, not an aid recipient, a superpower. So why isn't it? So here is where it gets deeply uncomfortable. What if the very wealth beneath Africa's soil is part of the problem? Economists call it the resource curse. The paradox where countries overflowing with natural resources end up poorer, less democratic, and more unstable than countries with almost nothing underground. It sounds impossible, but the evidence is overwhelming. Take Nigeria. Since the 1970s, Nigeria has earned over $600 billion in oil revenue. $600 billion. That is enough to fundamentally transform an entire continent, let alone one country. Yet today, nearly half of Nigeria's population lives in extreme poverty. Power cuts are routine, roads crumble, schools are underfunded, young people are desperate. How does a nation swim in oil money and still drown in poverty? This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern, repeated across Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and beyond. Abundant resources, broken outcomes. Something deeper is at work here. To understand Africa's economic reality today, you have to go back to the blueprint that was drawn without African hands at the table. At the 1884 Berlin Conference, European powers carved up an entire continent like a pie, not to build nations, but to build pipelines of extraction. Railroads weren't constructed to connect African cities to each other. They were built to move copper, gold, and rubber from mines to ports, and from ports to Europe. Local manufacturing was deliberately suppressed. Processing industries were never established. Africans were meant to dig, not to refine. And the borders? They were drawn with rulers on maps by men who had never set foot on African soil, splitting the Yoruba, the Somali, the Maasai across artificial lines while forcing rival groups into the same cage. When independence finally came in the 1960s, the colonial machinery remained perfectly intact. New flags flew over the same broken system. This structural weakness becomes painfully clear when you follow the money. When African nations export raw copper, cocoa, or crude oil, they capture only a tiny fraction of what that resource is ultimately worth. The real value is created later, through refining, manufacturing, branding, and marketing, and almost none of that happens on African soil. Consider cocoa. Africa produces roughly 70% of the world's cocoa supply. 70%. You would expect African nations to dominate the chocolate industry. Instead, they earn less than 6% of the global chocolate industry's total revenue. The beans leave African ports for pennies. They return as finished chocolate bars sold for dollars with European brand names printed on the wrapper. The processing, the packaging, the advertising, the retail, that is where fortunes are made. And that entire chain exists elsewhere. Africa does the hardest, dirtiest, lowest paid part of the work, while others collect the profits. This is not coincidence. It is the architecture of dependency, still standing decades after colonialism officially ended. Compounding these structural problems is the suffocating weight of international debt. Across Africa, governments desperate for development funding turn to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and foreign governments for loans. But these loans rarely came free. They came attached to conditions. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, structural adjustment programs swept across the continent. African nations were told to privatize state industries, slash social spending, and throw open their markets to foreign competition. On paper, it sounded like economic modernization. In practice, it was devastating. Infant industries that needed time and protection to grow were suddenly exposed to competition from heavily subsidized Western corporations. Local manufacturers collapsed. Healthcare and education budgets were gutted. Governments lost the very tools that developed nations had used to build their own economies. The cruel irony is that no wealthy nation industrialized under these conditions. America, Germany, and South Korea all protected their industries during development. Africa was denied that same right, but debt is only part of the bleeding. There is another wound largely invisible that cuts even deeper. Every single year, Africa loses over $88 billion through tax evasion, trade mispricing, and profit shifting by multinational corporations. Let that number settle for a moment. $88 billion gone, not through war or mismanagement, but through sophisticated financial manipulation hidden inside spreadsheets and offshore accounts. This means more money flows out of Africa annually than flows in through foreign aid and investment combined. The continent is, in net terms, a donor to the rest of the world. Mining and oil companies are particularly skilled at this extraction. They negotiate contracts, often with underpaid or pressured government officials, that leave African governments receiving a fraction of the actual value pulled from their own soil. The minerals leave, the profits leave, and Africa is left holding an invoice for the roads built to carry those minerals to foreign ports. Corruption in Africa is real, and its consequences are devastating. Billions meant for hospitals, schools, and roads vanish into private accounts while ordinary citizens suffer. But here is where the narrative gets deliberately incomplete. Corruption is rarely a solo performance. Western corporations have been caught repeatedly paying bribes to African officials to secure mining licenses and oil contracts. Global banks in London, Switzerland, and Delaware quietly hold the stolen funds, no questions asked. Offshore tax havens, mostly operated under Western jurisdictions, are where looted African wealth goes to disappear. The United States itself passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act precisely because American companies were bribing foreign governments so routinely it became a legal problem at home. And when a corrupt African leader keeps resource deals favorable to foreign corporations, those corporations rarely complain. They fund the corruption, then blame the continent for being corrupt. Calling corruption uniquely African is not analysis. It is a convenient distraction from the architects sitting comfortably abroad. Africa's resource wealth has never gone unnoticed by powerful nations. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union turned African nations into proxy battlegrounds, funding rival factions not out of ideological concern, but to secure access to strategic minerals and trade routes. That competition never truly ended. It simply changed players. Today, The United States, China, France, and Russia are all aggressively competing for influence across the continent, signing military agreements, building bases, and securing resource contracts that often favor the foreign partner far more than the African nation. The most chilling signal came through blood. Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected leader, sought control over his nation's vast mineral wealth. He was assassinated in 1961 with Western involvement. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso tried to break free from foreign debt and dependency. He was killed in 1987. The message sent to African leaders was unmistakable. Pursue true economic independence, and you will pay with your life. But resources alone mean nothing without the people to transform them. And here lies another devastating layer of Africa's trap: brain drain. Every year, approximately 70,000 skilled professionals leave the continent. Doctors, engineers, scientists, and academics pack their bags for Europe, North America, or the Gulf states, chasing better salaries, safer environments, and functioning institutions. Consider this. Ethiopia spends enormous resources training a doctor, only to watch that doctor build a career in London or Toronto. Ghana loses nurses faster than it can graduate them. This is not simply individual ambition. It is a structural hemorrhage. The consequences compound everything else we have discussed. Without skilled professionals, African nations cannot process their own minerals, cannot build competitive industries, cannot strengthen governance systems. They become permanently dependent on foreign expertise, often paying billions to hire back the very talent their own soil produced. The continent is essentially subsidizing the developed world's workforce while starving its own future. But something is shifting. Across the continent, a new generation of leaders and citizens is waking up to the trap and refusing to accept it as permanent. Rwanda has transformed itself through disciplined governance, heavy investment in education and technology, and strict accountability measures. Ethiopia has pursued aggressive industrialization, building textile and manufacturing sectors to move beyond raw agricultural exports. Botswana turned its diamond wealth into sovereign funds and social investment, becoming one of Africa's most stable economies. Perhaps most boldly, Zimbabwe and the Democratic Republic of Congo have recently banned the export of raw minerals, forcing companies to process and refine resources locally before they leave African soil. This single policy move demands that value addition happens at home, creating jobs and capturing far greater economic returns. These are not accidents. They are deliberate choices, proof that the resource curse is not destiny. African nations are increasingly demanding ownership over their own futures, and the world is being forced to take notice. Then came a shift that many economists are calling one of the most important economic experiments of the 21st century. In 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area, known as AfCFTA, officially launched. This single agreement brought together 54 countries and 1.3 billion people under one unified trading bloc, making it the largest free trade area in the world by number of participating nations. But what makes AfCFTA genuinely revolutionary is not just its size, it is its purpose. For generations, Africa exported to the world and imported finished goods back at a premium. AfCFTA aims to flip that script entirely. When African nations trade with each other, something powerful happens. Supply chains begin forming within the continent. Factories open. Manufacturing jobs are created. Value stays home instead of traveling overseas. A Kenyan textile company can supply a Nigerian fashion brand. An Ethiopian processor can supply a South African retailer. The wealth circulates internally. That is how economies actually grow. Now here is where the story could genuinely change direction. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth with a median age of just 19 years. By 2050, nearly 40% of all young people in the world will be African. That is not a footnote. That is a seismic demographic shift. When a large young population enters the workforce productively, it can trigger explosive economic growth. We saw this happen across East Asia in the late 20th century. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore transformed from developing economies into global powerhouses within a single generation. Africa has the raw human material to do the same, arguably at an even greater scale. But here is the critical condition. It only works with intentional investment. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, and real job creation must meet this generation where they are. Without that, this demographic dividend flips into something far more dangerous, a demographic time bomb of mass unemployment, frustration, and instability. The youth are coming regardless. The only question is whether opportunity will meet them. This is not a conversation about charity. It is about accountability. Wealthy nations and corporations must stop extracting Africa's resources without equitable return. Unpayable debts accumulated under exploitative conditions must be cancelled. Offshore tax havens, which swallow billions in African wealth annually, must be shut down. Foreign aid attached to suffocating conditions must be replaced with genuine support for African-led development on African terms. For centuries, the global North built its prosperity on the back of African labor, African land, and African resources. The gleaming infrastructure of Europe and North America did not emerge from nothing. It was financed, in significant part, by systematic extraction from this continent. This is not ancient history. It is the living architecture of today's global economy. Every smartphone containing cobalt mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, every chocolate bar made from West African cocoa, carries within it an unpaid debt. The world's prosperity and Africa's exploitation are not separate stories. They are the same story. Let's be clear about something. Africa is not poor. Africa has been impoverished, deliberately, systematically, and continuously, by structures designed to funnel its wealth outward for centuries. That distinction matters enormously. Poverty implies a natural condition. Impoverishment implies a choice made by someone, somewhere, at someone else's expense. The resources are there. The land is there. The people, brilliant and resilient and young, are there. The question was never whether Africa has what it takes to rise. The question is whether the world will stop profiting from its suppression, and whether Africa's own leaders will finally choose their people over their foreign patrons. This is a call to awareness. Learn the systems. Name the mechanisms. Demand accountability from corporations, governments, and institutions that have fed on this continent for generations. Africa's rightful place in the global order is not at the margins. It is at the center, and the world cannot afford to pretend otherwise any longer.